Hello and welcome back to Oddtober, the month of the year that we dedicate to talking about all things Oddworld related. And wouldn't you know it, we're finally at the point where we're going to be talking about the newest game released in the Oddworld series, with Oddworld Soulstorm. Now my original intention with this was to review the game when it first released all the way back in April. It was even free on PlayStation Plus for PS5 users, so I was able to get my hands on it without even spending any extra money. However, when I first started playing it, I was so disappointed with it that I gave up halfway through and scrapped my review. The reason for this is because the game was quite clearly released in an unfinished state, and it lacked the polish that I expect coming from a developer as legendary as Oddworld Inhabitants. Now though, half a year after its initial release, and after several updates and patches, I want to revisit the game and give it a proper review. So my biggest questions going into this are, is the game finally in a finished state? And if it is, could I recommend that you also give this game a second chance too? Let's find out. The game opens with an introduction cutscene showing a bunch of newspaper headlines which detail the aftermath of Oddworld New and Tasty. While we know that Abe has managed to free 300 Medokans from slavery and destroy Rupture Farms in the process, these headlines are spun in a way that make it look like all of the Medokans died in the destruction and Moloch, the Gluckan CEO of the facility, was behind the explosion. This leaves Moloch on the run and Abe not knowing exactly where he stands in the situation. Something to point out here is that despite many people referring to Oddworld Soulstorm as a remake of Abe's Exodus, the sequel to the original Abe's Odyssey, this actually isn't completely accurate. Soulstorm is more so a complete reimagining of Abe's Exodus, and while it does feature a few of the same locations, it uses completely different level designs and the story is dramatically altered. For example, in Abe's Exodus, Moloch actually died in the destruction of Rupture Farms, and to be honest, the fact that Rupture Farms was obliterated doesn't seem to have impacted anything all too much. In Soulstorm though, Moloch is very much alive, and the entire game is basically all about the aftermath of the fall of Rupture Farms. The way to think of it is basically like this. Abe's Odyssey, Abe's Exodus, and Muncher's Odyssey exist in a separate timeline, and New and Tasty started off the reimagined timeline, which then leads to Soulstorm and any future games. While New and Tasty is a straight-up remake of Abe's Odyssey though, Soulstorm isn't a remake of Abe's Exodus. It's also currently unknown if Stranger's Wrath still exists in the reimagined timeline, but with it being completely unrelated to the other games, you can pretty much slot it in any way you want. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, we now move on to the main menu, and this is an area that I think really could have done with more work. I get that in the grand scheme of things it doesn't really matter what the menu of a game looks like, but when you compare this kinda generic looking menu to the original games, it's such a stark contrast. The original games blasted you in the face with atmospheric music straight away. They had these incredibly detailed and graphically impressive opening cinematics, and then they opened to an interactive menu that Abe himself would guide you through. Even having the option of learning the GameSpeak controls and seeing how expressive Abe is without even playing the game itself. Now though, we just have this dark background with Abe's face at the side not really doing anything, and the GameSpeak option has been replaced by this control screen which has no interactivity or impressive design at all. Like I said, this really isn't too much of an issue because it is just a menu, but it goes to show the absolute passion that went into those original games. And I'm not saying that that passion isn't there now, but the original games were probably a lot more focused. Anyway, let's stop talking about these darn menus and actually start the game. When we start a new game, we're immediately greeted with a cutscene. Abe, Alf, and a new Medokan to Soulstorm called Toby are driving a train towards Soulstorm Brewery while being chased by a group of flying sligs. Abe is seemingly transfixed on a mysterious object while Alf and Toby panic as they try to keep the train moving. Alf tries to get Abe's attention through a locked door, but Abe is so zoned out that he doesn't seem to hear. It's at this point that we flash back to several hours ago. Abe has just escaped Rupture Farms after the events of New and Tasty and is taking refuge in the Monsaic Lines. This is a safe haven for the native Madokans living in the area. Abe is being told by a shaman that his destiny is to become the saviour of the Madokans and that he needs to lead a revolution to put a stop to the rampant industrialisation, enslavement and destruction being caused by the Glukkons. Abe is reluctant, with him being an ordinary Madokan and thinking his journey was over now that he's escaped. He complains that he and the other escapees are all tired, but the shaman continues to pressure him. While all of this is going on, a Madokan who's escaped from a nearby facility is attempting to reach Abe, but he's been shot and is slowly bleeding out. This Madokan accidentally leads the Glukkons to Abe's hiding place, and then panic ensues, which leads to the Rupture Farms escapees accidentally setting the place ablaze when a crate of Soulstorm brew bottles catch fire. It's at this point where the first level begins, but before we start talking about the gameplay, I first want to bring attention to these cutscenes. I mean, can we just take a second to talk about how amazing these look? This really feels like the progression of the cutscenes from Abe's Odyssey and Abe's Exodus, and this is the first time since those games that I feel like they've nailed the visual style and the tone of Oddworld. The quality of the graphics and the amazingly expressive animation, combined with the absolutely incredible voice acting, makes these cutscenes an absolute joy to watch. I honestly wish there were more of them, which isn't to say that there's not enough, but I just love them so much that I want to see even more. This is one area of Soulstorm that is truly exceptional. The slight redesigns the characters have undergone is really good too, and I feel like this is the definitive look for all of the creatures in the game. Now though, the game actually begins, and this is where I was originally quite thrown off when I played this game all the way back in April. This is just a very different experience to the one that you had with the original two games, or even New and Tasty. It's much faster paced, and there's a lot of new mechanics to sink your teeth into as well. And while I don't think that these new mechanics necessarily make the game better than the original games, they do end up making Soulstorm feel very distinct. First of all, Abe is much more agile than in the previous games. He's not only faster and can take far more damage this time around, but he can also double jump and swing across monkey bars. This obviously takes away from the whole cinematic platformer vibe of the previous games and turns Soulstorm into much more of a sort of generic feeling side-scroller. While this isn't necessarily a bad thing, I do feel like a lot of the way that we're related to the older games came from the fact that not only was the story and universe being presented to us grounded in reality due to it being similar to the way our own world operates, only obviously a much more extreme mirror image, but also because you could identify with Abe because he could only really do things that any regular person could do. That is aside from the possession ability, obviously. In Soulstorm though, he feels like much more of a capable video game character, which to be fair might be intentional due to him having more experience as a hero after the previous game, but I almost feel like I would have liked to have seen Abe learn how to double jump within the story so that it made more contextual sense. Other than Abe's new athletic prowess though, he also now has the ability to loot for items and craft them into more powerful tools throughout his adventure. This is something that I really wasn't too fond of when I first played Soulstorm, because I felt like it wasn't quite utilised enough to be worth having in the game. While I do still somewhat feel like it could have done with giving you more freedom with how you tackle certain puzzles and obstacles, I did actually end up enjoying this new mechanic, especially later in the game when you get access to more crafting recipes. I will admit though that really this whole crafting thing does just boil down to making weapons to use against the enemies in order to either kill them or take them down passively. There are certain moments where you need to burn wooden obstacles in order to get around or to rescue Madokans, or you can destroy metallic flooring with explosions to discover secret areas. But these more dynamic elements are only used very sparingly, and I get the impression that this concept had to be scaled way back during development. Because the crafting is only really used to create makeshift weapons though, I feel like it's quite easy to get the hang of and doesn't detract from the core gameplay too much. It's basically just a matter of every now and then going into a menu to craft a bouncing candy or an exploding fizzy drink, and then throwing it at enemies during the more combat-heavy sequences. What I really didn't like though is how when you finish a level, everything in your inventory is taken away and you start the next level with nothing. So you can spend ages scavenging for materials and save them for an encounter that never actually arrives, and then end the level and feel like you've wasted quite a lot of your time getting all of these items in the first place. Plus, it makes no narrative sense that Abe would just drop all of the things he's collected upon reaching the next area. I get why this had to be done in order to balance the levels properly, but it just feels a little bit cheap at times, and I wish the game would have given you more freedom to be creative with the items you find. Especially in terms of playing with dynamic elements of the environment, I feel like that's a particularly underutilized idea. Another new aspect of Soulstorm are these more combat-heavy sections that almost feel like wave defense areas. This is where you'll really be putting all of those items you've been crafting to use, as well as making use of Abe's possession ability that returns in this game. These sections can differ a little bit in terms of the overarching objective, like sometimes you'll be protecting hundreds of Mudokons as they escape in the background while you kill as many sligs as possible in the foreground. Sometimes it'll just be about you surviving on your own while waiting for a contraption to finish doing its job. Or sometimes it'll be more about directly protecting a smaller group of Mudokons. These are easily some of the most difficult moments of the entire game, and I will admit that a lot of the time it boils down to trial and error, because you basically just have to memorize the enemy patterns. I would imagine that a lot of people absolutely hate these bits, especially considering that the checkpoints can be very unforgiving. However, I do have to admit that I did end up actually liking these bits. When I started more heavily utilising the crafting mechanic, and when I discovered you didn't actually need to rescue every single last Mudokon, and to get the best ending you only need to rescue 80% of them in each level, these parts became so much better. When I played Soulstorm back when it was initially released, I was getting incredibly frustrated, and I think it's because I was trying to save everyone. I mean, after all, this is what I always try to do in every other Oddworld game. But you have to get out of that mindset for Soulstorm and just accept the fact that some Mudokons are gonna die. You don't lead a resistance group and expect not to suffer any casualties after all. Don't get me wrong though, these bits can still be a bit annoying, and I do feel like some of them drag on a little bit too long, but they're okay and they offer a bit of variety too. Now, we've been talking about all of the new stuff that's been added into Soulstorm for quite a while. Stuff like the more intense platforming sections that are possible thanks to Abe's new moveset, the crafting mechanic which allows you to play around with the more dynamic elements, and the more combat-heavy sequences as well. But this is still an Oddworld game, so what features make a return from the previous entries? The obvious thing is that Abe can still speak to Mudokons and has to lead them to portals in order to rescue them. The Mudokons this time around are much more capable too, being able to jump across gaps, hoist themselves up onto ledges, and they can actually even defend themselves if you give them some of your items. The fact that the Mudokons can now jump is really good, and there's loads of moments where this is put to amazing use by having you need to guide them over gaps and through drills without getting turned into mincemeat. Or there's even moments where you're jumping across train tracks while the trains are zooming towards you. It's basically an extension of the way that you guided Mudokons around in the original games, and when you're doing this sort of thing, it feels exactly like what you would expect from Oddworld. What's interesting though is that despite the Mudokons being able to crouch in this game, they're still unable to roll, meaning that the only game in the series where this is possible is none other than Oddworld Adventures 2 for the Game Boy Color. Take that, Oddworld Soulstorm! While this is all well and good, the Mudokons are absolutely terrible at defending themselves, and I literally only even utilised this mechanic a single time in the entire game. There were 4 or so Mudokons who I gave candy to in order to throw at a slig that was gonna spawn in a particular area. I set everything up perfectly and thought that I was a tactical genius, and then they threw the candy at a slig and were instantly slaughtered by it. So I just never even bothered to try this again. Maybe this was a mistake on my part, because if I would have armed them with more powerful items, maybe they could have actually have helped me during the later parts of the game. But to be honest, I didn't ever feel like I needed them to help me, and I kinda just wanted them to stay safe and get out of the way. So yeah, while I like this idea in concept, I'm not sure that the game even needed this to be a thing. I think maybe it overcomplicates the situation a bit. Now, remember how in Abe's Odyssey there were moments where you used GameSpeak to get past native Madokans by memorizing whistle patterns? Or how you could just mess around and interact with the other Madokans by farting and stuff? Or remember in Abe's Exodus where Madokans had different emotional states, like being wired, depressed or angry, and you even encountered blind ones too? And all of these different Madokans had to be interacted with in different ways and presented different gameplay challenges to overcome? Well yeah, Soulstorm actually scraps all of this. The GameSpeak options presented here are potentially the most basic we've ever seen in an Oddworld game, apart from Stranger's Wrath where it wasn't even a thing. Basically the only real commands you have are saying follow me and wait. I mean, to be fair, this is functionally what the Oddworld games have always boiled down to, but by removing all of the other stuff, you don't really feel as connected to the Madokans as you previously did. And it also means that a lot of the unique ideas for puzzles based around the Madokans' emotional states have been completely cut. And this is a shame, because if anything, I wanted to see this expanded. The Madokans do chatter in the background while they're following you though, which can be pretty entertaining.
Oh my god, I'm bored. I am so bored.
This guy next to me is really bored.
He smells too.
But even with that giving them a degree of personality, it's not as good or as detailed as we've seen in games created 24 years ago. The sligs that you possess through the game don't even have a single instance where you need to use GameSpeak. You don't talk to slogs or open slig locks or anything. Speaking of sligs and slogs, an important part of the Oddworld games has always been all of the different creatures that inhabit them. So, what new stuff do we see in Oddworld Soulstorm? This is a tricky one. Technically, there's only one single new species in Soulstorm, but others have been expanded quite significantly, which I'm a big fan of. For example, the sligs are by far the most common enemy type in the game, and I would say that 95% of the enemies consist of them. You might think this would be a bit boring, but luckily the sligs are so versatile that it's not too much of a problem. Not only do we have the standard walking version as well as the return of the flying slig, but they also all carry different weapons and can be wearing different types of armour too. So they can be carrying machine guns, flamethrowers, rocket launchers, Gatling guns, or even stun clubs. And later in the game they can be wearing tinfoil hats which make them immune to Abe's possession, or flame-resistant suits that make them invulnerable to fire. I love this because it really shows off just how heavily armed the sligs are, and you need to approach situations differently depending on what type of slig is ahead of you. There's even moments where sniper sligs will be in the distance and you need to avoid the sights, or they'll instantly kill you. It's all fun stuff. The issue then is simply that, because the sligs are so expanded here, all of the other creatures either fall into the background or are completely absent from the gameplay. Even some of the most iconic species don't make a single appearance here. Paramites, Scrabs, Elam, Fleechers, Gluckans and Vikers are all completely absent. And it's disappointing because not only would I have liked to have seen these for even more variety in gameplay, but I wanted to see them with the new Soulstorm designs. Obviously some of these species do make appearances in cutscenes, most notably the Gluckans, but we do also get several glimpses of the Vikers too. But in terms of the actual gameplay, none of these are ever seen. We do still get slogs and greeters though, but like I said earlier, the slogs feel a bit watered down due to them not being used in tandem with the sligs, and the greeters are the same as they were in Abe's Exodus, basically being instant death motion detectors. Another disappointing thing with all of this is that when you do come across these different species, there's no lore to go along with them being presented in the game. In Abe's Exodus, when you came to a new enemy, there was always these information points where you could learn more about the world and its inhabitants. And the fact these information drops were actually a physical thing in the game's world kept you immersed. Now though, you just enter a room and oh, there's a greeter. If you had only played New and Tasty and went into Soulstorm with no other knowledge of the previous games, you literally wouldn't even know that this was called a greeter. Like I say though, we do have one new species though, and it's called a Sleech. According to the Oddworld wiki, these are the adult versions of a Fleech. However, I have absolutely no idea where they got this information from, because as far as I can tell, this isn't said in the game, and it's not in the art book either. So I've either missed something, or people are just assuming this based on the similar names. The Sleechers are actually only featured in a single level, but I actually really like the gameplay mechanic attached to these. It feels like something that would have been in the original games if they would have had the technology to pull it off. So Sleechers are basically these fuzzy little balls that chase after you and will very quickly kill you if they get close. Because they live in the depths of a cave though, they're super sensitive to light and they'll back away from any light source that they come across. Abe can use this to his advantage by using a torch he has for this level, or by throwing flares around too. And this whole section feels like it's straight out of Abe's Odyssey. It's even structured like the Paramonia and Scribania temple sections, with you coming up to a hub area and entering levels to light flintlocks in order to get to the final Sleech trial. It's a very good part of the game and offers something completely different to any other level. The one thing I don't like about these Sleechers though is that they look really boring. They're literally just black blobs with bright eyes, and I feel like they could have been made to look much more sinister and scary, more akin to something like a Paramite. I mean, if it's true that they're supposed to be the adult versions of a Fleech, then why couldn't they have been a big worm with massive teeth that move really fast or something? It's disappointing because although I love this section of the game, it could have had so much more of an impact if the creatures looked a bit more interesting and were maybe built up a bit more too. Because there's a lack of new enemy types, and also a lack of returning enemy types too, Abe's possession ability this time around can actually only take control of the Sligs, meaning that we've kind of gone back to how it was in Abe's Odyssey. But that isn't to say that Abe's possession doesn't have some new elements attached to it too. The way that possession works in this game is probably the best it's been since Abe's Exodus. Since that game, they really seem to have struggled to work out a way to get it working in a 3D space or with a free-flowing 2D camera. With Soulstorm, they've opted to allow you to move a possession orb around freely, but it's limited with how far you can go because of a chant meter. Of course, there's also chant suppressors that stop Abe from being able to do this a lot of the time too, so the possession is stopped from being overpowered. A couple of interesting things with this though are that firstly, you can now knock Sligs out when you depossess them, rather than making them explode, brutally killing them. This creates the opportunity to do pacifist runs of the game, where you try not to kill anything at all. But also, when you depossess a Slig in this way, you actually regain control of the possession orb and can move to another enemy and chain together different possessions, all with one chant. This is a really interesting concept, and it could have been used in really unique ways, where you needed to control a Slig to sneak past loads of security, and then on the other side you possess a flying Slig to get past obstacles, and then you possess another Slig with a flamethrower to burn past a wooden obstacle. And all of this could have been done in one seamless chain. However, I kid you not, there is only a single time that you ever need to actually use this possession chaining, and it's not even all that interesting either. Why on earth this mechanic wasn't actually explored a lot more is beyond me. They obviously knew that it was possible because they do use it in this one area. But why wasn't this expanded more? It's so weird because there could have even have been the potential for an entire level to have made use out of this concept, and yet they hardly ever even touch on it. Despite the game having some of these more disappointing elements though, I would still say that there's more good here than bad, and the experience as a whole turned out to be very enjoyable. Flawed, don't get me wrong, but very enjoyable. But before we get into the elements of the game that I think are actually heavily flawed, I first want to talk about all of the elements of the game that I actually really enjoyed. First of all, I want to say right off the bat that this game probably has some of the best 2.5D effects that I've ever seen. The developers even started referring to it as 2.9D, and at first I was kinda thinking that that was just a pompous marketing tactic. But I actually do get what they mean now. It's not just the way that paths will curve in and out of the background while the camera smoothly transitions and follows Abe seamlessly, all while maintaining a consistent level of control and not feeling jarring at all, but it's also how there's these moments where you can look through binoculars and see the world from a first-person perspective, and you can kinda see how all of these side-scrolling paths actually make sense in a 3D space. I also love the moments when the camera will pull out and reveal just how big the world is around Abe, and these moments where obstacles will be coming at you from the background and the foreground, which give the world some depth. It's easy to look at this and say, well, I've played 2.5D games before, like Little Big Planet or even Klonoa, but Soulstorm really does take this to the next level, using it not only to create a spectacle and make the world feel real, but also using it in the gameplay too. The graphics in general are also really good. Almost every area of the game feels completely distinct, and it was a joy to see some of the locations from Abe's Exodus make a return here. Like we've got Necrum, the Slig Barracks, and especially Fico Depot, which is probably my absolute favourite location from any Oddworld game. As well as the environment looking great though, there's also a lot of attention to detail with character animation. Like how Abe will sneak a little bit slower depending on how much you're tilting the stick. Things like that you probably wouldn't typically notice, but subconsciously it makes the game feel much tighter and well produced. The lighting effects are also pretty great, especially in the cave areas when you're using flares to light your way. You can tell they were really proud of this and wanted to show it off here, and it's for good reason. It does look really impressive and it creates this mysterious atmosphere too. Now, one of the big things that I want to point out here is that, like I've said it multiple times throughout this video, I actually really didn't like this game when it first came out. So, what's changed since then? Have I just come at it from a different perspective or something? Well, no. The only thing that's happened is that the game has actually received some significant updates since I last played it. The updates that the game has received have honestly made so much of a difference that it feels like the game was in its beta form when it was released. The moment where this was most apparent was this bit where you need to destroy a big cannon that a Slig is controlling, which is called a Slig Mammer. I'm being serious here. When I played the game in April, I was stuck on this bit for 2 hours. I was replaying the same section over and over again. It was so difficult that it was putting me off of even wanting to carry on playing. Now though, playing it after the updates, I did it on my first attempt in like 5 seconds. I'm not even joking, that's how much this game has been changed based on fan feedback. There's other parts too that have been dramatically altered, like this level where a blimp is shooting at you with an artillery strike. And back when the game was released, these shots were so constant and sporadic that it was basically entirely down to luck as to whether you made it through or not. Now though, it shoots less frequently and much more predictably, making it actually possible to get through the level in a way that feels fair. On top of these more major changes, they've also completely fixed the Slig AI, because before it was a constant problem where the Sligs would just get stuck on the patrol route and stand still, therefore making it impossible to actually progress. Items no longer get stuck in mid-air when you throw them. Abe snaps much better to platforms and monkey bars, making it easier to actually platform around. And there's been all sorts of other tweaks that make the game feel so much more polished than when it first came out. This is exactly why I wanted to wait to do this review. I knew that if I reviewed it on release, then when the game was updated, my review wouldn't reflect my true opinion of the game anymore. So while I do think I made the right choice with that, I can't help but feel a little bit let down by the state that the game was released in initially. Not only because I was let down as someone who loves the Oddworld series, I mean it's my favourite game series ever made after all, but because I feel like all of the more negative reviews that were published when the game came out have probably put a lot of people off of giving this game a second chance, or a chance at all. Honestly, if you were like me and played this when it was released, give it another shot now, and if you've never played it at all, I can honestly recommend that you get it now that it's been patched and updated. I mean, this is all great stuff, right? And it's easy for me to sit here and talk about all of the positives and gush about everything that I liked about it, but there are still some seriously big problems here that I want to address. Probably one of my biggest problems with the game from a creative standpoint is that I think that the music and the audio design in general is really lacking. Maybe this was an area that needed more money being pumped into it or something, but this really isn't up to the standard of what I expect from Oddworld at all. The music is unmemorable and doesn't have any leitmotifs for any of the areas or situations you find yourself in, which honestly makes the locations you visit lack a degree of atmosphere. Like I said, the FICO depot is one of my favourite locations from Oddworld, and of course a big reason for that is the visuals and the new gameplay mechanics it introduces, but another reason is for the music. Whenever I think about the FICO depot, I can hear the music straight away. It's ingrained in my memory despite how simple of a tune it is, but it's effective and it works. There's not a single track from Soulstorm that I can actually remember, and maybe this is to do with the music itself being more ambient and having less of a melody at the forefront of the experience, but I feel like it could also be that there's too many other sound effects and things going on that drown it out a bit. I'm no audio expert, so I can't say for sure what the issue is, but I can recognise that there's definitely an issue somewhere with this. A more glaringly obvious issue with the audio is that it sometimes just sounds really bad. Like listen to this section here where Abe is talking to these Madokans.
Are you Abe?
It's all over the place. 1 second Abe is quiet because he's in the distance, then the other Madokans are really loud, the sound effects are all over the place. This needed more attention putting into it. There's also this bit I came to where there's this huge menacing drill, and at first I was like, whoa, this is going to be a good bit, but then I got closer, and this is what I heard.
Wait. Everyone stop complaining! You told us to stop!
Is this drill even making a noise at all? Like, this should have been so loud that it was almost disorientating, right? Like, it should have been this really climactic moment where you reach the core of Necron Mines and the drills are at the most menacing, but it's just completely let down by the audio. This is coming from a series where the original games have literally been completed by someone who was completely blind. The way that they were able to finish those games is that the audio design was so good and everything had such a distinct noise that you could tell where things were even without looking. I know I've been going on about this for a while now, but my point is that the audio design here is just not up to par. Now, I know that I've said that the game's graphics are good, and don't get me wrong, they are, but there's some moments where there's this really jarring effect because you're looking at the screen and everything looks really good, but there's this one glaringly obvious thing that looks terrible, and it really detracts from the whole experience. The most obvious moment that this happened for me was this bit where you rescue hundreds of Madokans from imprisonment and watch them escape. but they're all just copied and pasted and they're running at a far lower frame rate than the rest of the game, and they kinda just look like cardboard cutouts. I mean, what is going on here? It can't just be me who thinks this looks really bad, right? Am I just being harsh here, or is this just really jarring to see? There's also loads of times that the camera will move into the background and things will suddenly just pop into existence. Sometimes this is really obnoxious too, and it affects gameplay because it'll be something like a sniper suddenly appearing out of nowhere. And it's just weird when you're playing a game that has such a high standard for its graphical fidelity, only to have these glaringly apparent issues take away from it all. The game also aims to run at 60 frames a second, but honestly, it really struggles to maintain this. Just like New and Tasty, it drops a frame every single time you activate a checkpoint, but there's also moments beside that where it stutters a bit too. I'm really not sure exactly why this is still an issue. You'd have thought that they would have smoothed this out since New and Tasty released, but it must be harder to fix than you'd think, I suppose. Then we have some issues with the gameplay itself, like the checkpoint system being a little bit too unforgiving and creating situations where you slowly make your way through an area, looting everything you see and crafting loads of stuff, sneaking past sligs and all sorts of other things, only to be killed at the end and have all of that progression reset. At times it makes you not want to bother looting and crafting or being sneaky at all, because you're aware that with one slip up you'll have wasted potentially minutes of your time. There's no quick save in Soulstorm either, so you can't manually create checkpoints this time. However, a good middle ground for this might have been to have allowed you to go back to an already activated checkpoint and press a button to reactivate it and keep any progress you've made. I do get why they didn't implement a quick save, because it would have been really easy to just overuse it and make the game too easy, but I don't think the way they approached it here is right either. I also hate how at times you can't backtrack to previous areas to get things that you missed. This is a really big issue considering how big some of these levels are, taking upwards of an entire hour. If you miss something and get locked out of backtracking, you've either just missed that thing for good, or you have to restart the entire level again. Maybe you should have been able to teleport to previously activated checkpoints or something. Or, you know, just don't block out the way backwards and let you walk back through all of the levels. Sometimes you can do this, but then other times it becomes a really annoying issue. A sort of similar problem is that sometimes it's not clear where the end of the level is, and you'll have Madokans still left to rescue, but you'll accidentally finish the level and leave them behind. That happened to me a couple of times, and it was so annoying. Luckily, I always had 80% of the Madokans rescued anyway, but can you imagine if that happened and I had to restart the entire level because of it? Then there's this super annoying bit of the game right here. This only happens in this one single area of the entire game, and it's so irritating. I don't know why they haven't patched this out. Basically, you start this level and you go through it normally just like usual until you reach this door that's locked. That's pretty weird, but you search around for a hidden lever or pressure pad or something to unlock it, but you don't find anything. You try chanting and talking to it, but that doesn't seem to work either. It just seems impossible to open this door. Bear in mind too that the only Madokans in the entire level are behind this door, so if you want to get the best ending, you need these Madokans. Well, before I went crazy spending hours looking for some kind of super hidden switch or something, I just decided to look this up, predicting that the solution would be something ridiculous, and wouldn't you know it, I was right. What you need to do is speedrun the level and get to the door in less than 5 minutes, otherwise it will close and lock you out. This is a stupid idea anyway, because you're clearly supposed to go through this level fairly slowly and sneak around a lot of the enemies. So it goes against the design of the game itself to do this. But on top of that, the game doesn't ever imply that you need to do this. There's no sign on the door with a timer on it or something saying that you need to get here fast. Nothing. How were you supposed to know to do this without looking it up? The door is already in a fairly hidden spot, so it could have literally just been a door that was always open and nobody would have thought anything about it. It's so goddamn annoying, and it just feels like the developers were playing a joke on us, because like I said, this is literally the only time in the game that anything like this ever happens. I hate it. Other than that though, a more nitpicky problem that I have is that there's no unlockables in the game. You don't even get a cutscene viewer or anything. That's really the least they could have done, and it would have been really cool to have had a quick way of watching through all of the cutscenes again. There's no cosmetic unlockables either, which is a shame considering that there was the Scrub Abe outfit in New and Tasty, which you had to buy. You would have thought that they would have put more stuff like that in here, only I would have appreciated if you didn't need to spend real money on it. You even collect this green goo throughout the game, with certain secret areas literally just having the goo there, and collecting this just refills your health. But most of the time I already had full health anyway, so it just felt like a bit of a waste. I feel like this green goo collectible should have probably have done something else, like upgraded your chant so that it lasted longer, or unlocked cosmetics or something as well. It would have made it far more rewarding to hunt them down. So overall, is Soulstorm as good as the original two Oddworld games? Well, no, it's quite clearly not, and to be honest, it doesn't come anywhere near close. The original games were just much more well produced, and presented the universe in a much more organic and interesting way, with them giving you more lore, and also not being as video gamey. Soulstorm just has a little bit too much going on, with stuff like health bars, HUD elements, tutorial pop-ups, the level by level structure, double jumping, and that sort of thing. But that isn't to say that Soulstorm isn't a good game in its own right though, and one of the ways that it maybe even exceeds the original games is with the story it tells. So, this is your spoiler warning. Go to the time on the screen now if you want to avoid any story information about the game, which I highly recommend you do if you haven't played it for yourself. And, with that out of the way, hopefully everybody's gone that needs to, let's talk about the story of Soulstorm. Like I said at the top of the video, the cutscenes in Soulstorm are absolutely mind-blowingly good. I can't believe just how much I ended up caring about Abe and the events of the game, and I loved how much more personality Abe had in this game and how much more emotion he's capable of. There's one bit fairly late in where Abe receives his chest marking and learns about the history of the Medokans, and afterwards he breaks down, curls up onto the floor, and starts crying. In previous games, Abe has obviously gone through a lot, but we have never ever seen this more humanised emotional side of him before. I kind of just want to pick him up and give him a hug. On top of Abe being more relatable though, we also get way more development of the side characters too. Alf the Medokan has always been a part of the Oddworld lore, but in the actual games his impact has always been extremely minimal. He sets up Alf's rehab and tea in Abe's Exodus, and he's rescued in the Alf's Escape DLC for New and Tasty, but he's never really had a proper role within the story. In Soulstorm though, he's finally a proper character, and he has a huge impact on the plot, being Abe's friend who helps him to steal a train and reach all of his destinations. Alf is sort of the comic relief character, but he's not stupid. He's actually quite intelligent and seems quite streetwise. But his snarky comments always got a good laugh out of me.
What the keeper said we need...
You found the keeper?
I did. And she told us what to do. But what she meant, I can't figure out.
Wait, she? Was she hot?
Hell, no, she was the oldest thing I've ever seen.
Moloch the Gluckon plays a huge role in the story too, following Abe as he makes his way through the game and trying to clear his name by bringing Abe to justice. He ends up making things way worse for himself though, because the more facilities that Abe destroys, the more that his name gets dragged through the mud. We basically end up with three sides. The Magog cartel, who control all of the industrialization and are after Moloch because they believe, at least publicly, that he destroyed Rupture Farms himself. We have Abe and the natives who are trying to free the people and put a stop to the Magog cartel's operations. And then we have Moloch on the other side, who's trying to stop Abe because he's one of the only people that know for certain that he's actually behind all of these attacks on the Gluckon operations. It's an interesting triangle of factions all fighting against each other. Much of the story focuses on this relationship between these three factions, but of course there is a more personal quest for Abe. He learns that Soulstorm brew is being used as a means of keeping any Mudokons from ever escaping their enslavement, because if they go 48 hours without the brew, then they'll die, making true escape impossible. Abe and the others then need to find a cure, create enough of it for every single Mudokon on the continent, and then actually distribute it by using Soulstorm Brewery itself. Meanwhile, Abe also needs to find someone called the Keeper, who apparently knows the secrets of the Mudokon's past. And after learning about this, he then gains the power to get entry to the brewery. Of course, after a long journey and rescuing over 1,000 Mudokons this time around, Abe is successful and the antidote for the brew addiction is spread across the entire continent. This enables the Mudokons to form a kind of resistance group and spread word of their uprising all over the place, causing this massive chain reaction. The game ends with Abe revealing to Alf and Toby that while learning about the past of the Mudokons, he also learned that everyone in Rupture Farms has the same mother. So he wants to go to a Gluckan city called Nollybab in order to find her and find out why she left them all. For Abe though, there's a little bit more of a personal thing going on because he wants to know why she gave him the stitches across his mouth. So the game ends on this cliffhanger with them all deciding to go to Nollybab, setting up part 3 of the Oddworld Quintology, which will definitely be interesting because we've never seen any kind of city environment in any of the games before. There are maybe some slight issues with the game's story, like Abe being given this weird mystical amulet containing this insect, but it's never really properly explained what this actually is. And Abe kinda randomly just comes across the tape that lets him know that Soulstorm brew is being used as a means to keep all of the Mudokons enslaved. And as well as this, I know that a lot of people are disappointed that Director Flegg and General Drippick don't make an appearance here. But we do get to see the Soulstorm version of Vice President Aslick, and I suspect that the 2 other Gluckans from Abe's Exodus will probably make appearances in the next Oddworld game. That is, if we even do get to see another game released in this series. I'm not 100% sure how well Soulstorm actually performed, especially with it being free on PlayStation Plus when it first released. But I really do hope that it did well enough to get future games in the series made, because they've set those games up so well with Soulstorm, and I just want to see Oddworld Inhabitants' vision finally come to life. I'm putting Oddworld Soulstorm in 3rd place in my series ranking, which honestly is so unexpected considering my opinion of the game when it first came out. Despite all of its flaws, it's still an incredibly enjoyable game, and its positives far outweigh its negatives. Like I said earlier, if you didn't enjoy this when you first played it, I urge you to start it again with all of the updates, go at it with a fresh mind, and then see if you like it now. It really is a shame that it didn't release in this form, because I feel like the reception would have been so much better, and I just hope that the sort of middling reviews it got hasn't forever tainted its reputation. The story is massively enjoyable, there's a lot of variety in gameplay, the graphics are good, the controls are much better now that it's been updated, and the Oddworld universe is just such an interesting one to see. Sure, there's some technical hiccups and the audio design is really quite bad, but I can enjoy a game even if it does have some issues, so long as the positives are still there. It doesn't reach the insane level of quality as seen in Abe's Odyssey and Exodus, in fact, it's not even anywhere close, but it's way better than New and Tasty, and even has the edge over Stranger's Wrath in my opinion too. Definitely give it a go. And that sums up my thoughts on Oddworld Soulstorm. I can't even begin to tell you how happy I am that I waited to play this game to completion until it was updated. Like I've been saying, at first I really didn't like this game, and I even went as far as to cancel my pre-order of the collector's edition for it. That's just how much I didn't enjoy it. Now though, I've done a complete 180 and I actually really like it. In fact, it's up there among my favourite Oddworld games, which is kinda crazy for me to be saying. I just hope that Soulstorm did well enough for us to finally see that 3rd Quintology game, or maybe even just some DLC for Soulstorm where we play as Alf or something. That'd be pretty cool. But until that happens, we've officially reviewed every single Oddworld game ever released, which is pretty insane. We're not quite done with Oddtober just yet though, because we've still got a couple of other Oddworld topics still left for us to tackle. So join me next week for yet another Oddworld video. If you enjoyed this one, give it a like, leave a comment down below letting me know if you're gonna give Soulstorm a second chance, subscribe to see more stuff like this coming soon, and I'll see you next time. Bye!